The night wind carried the smell of smoke and wild sage across the desert, moving softly through the red canyons that glowed under a restless moon. In the distance, the drums of the Apache echoed faintly, steady as a heartbeat. Rising from somewhere beyond the cliffs, where the firelight flickered like spirits calling out to the stars, it was the kind of night when even silence had a pulse, and every shadow seemed alive. At the edge of a dying fire stood a man whose eyes held the same fire as the flames before him. His body was marked by the scars of battles fought for pride, land, and love. He had no name spoken by white townsfolk, only whispers of what he'd done and what he'd become. To some, he was a ghost of the old wars. To others, he was the last warrior who still believed in honor when the world around him had turned to dust. That night, his heart wasn't restless because of war, it was because of her. The woman who had been promised to another, the one who had once smiled at him across the canyon when they were children. For the white fences, the contracts, and the town's rules came between them. She was the daughter of a rancher who'd grown rich on land her people once called sacred. She had eyes the color of the Rio Grande at sunset and a spirit that burned bright, even when she tried to hide it beneath lace and obedience. He remembered her laughter before she learned to stay quiet in a world where women were expected to be still, and men were told who they could love when he heard of her engagement. The old drums inside his heart began to beat again. The town had gathered to celebrate her future, stringing ribbons along the fences and lighting lanterns that danced over the desert wind. The man she was promised to was everything he wasn't, wealthy, polished, and powerful in a way that came from papers, not from courage. But what the town didn't know was that the Apache had already claimed her long ago. Not by words, not by law, but by a bond the desert itself had witnessed. A promise made beneath the old tree near the river, where they'd met when they were young and foolish. Before life taught them to hide what was true, the ranch house was alive with music that night. Violins and laughter spilling into the cold air while outside. The lone figure watched from the shadows of the canyon ridge. His stallion waited nearby, dark and still as the night itself. He had not come for war. He had come for something deeper, a reckoning of the soul. Every heartbeat carried the weight of his choice. To let her go would be easier. But some loves weren't meant to be buried beneath duty. They were carved into bone, the kind that no lawman or preacher could erase. Inside the house, she stood before a mirror, her hands trembling as she fastened the pearl clasp at her throat. The reflection that stared back at her wasn't the girl she used to be. It was the woman the town wanted her to become, the quiet wife of a man she didn't love. The music outside felt distant, muffled beneath the sound of her own heart. She closed her eyes and saw him again, the Apache who had once carried her across the river when she'd fallen from her horse. The man whose silence had spoken more than any words ever could. She tried to forget, to bury those memories beneath the comfort of safety, but love doesn't vanish with time. It waits. It lingers. And sometimes it returns when you least expect it. As the night deepened, the desert began to hum with an ancient stillness. Coyotes cried in the distance, and the wind turned colder. The celebration grew louder in the valley, but beneath the noise, another sound began to rise, a steady rhythm of hooves striking the earth. The guards at the gate turned their heads just as a rider emerged from the shadows. The firelight catching the edge of his hair and the steel of his gaze, he didn't slow down. The ground shook beneath the power of his horse as he rode through the open gates without a word. The crowd froze, music fading into a hush as every eye turned toward the man. Who had come uninvited, he stopped at the edge of the lantern light, dismounted, and walked forward with the calm of someone who feared nothing. His presence alone silenced the air. The groom-to-be stepped forward, anger flashing in his eyes. "You have no right to be here," he said. "She belongs to me." The Apache's gaze didn't waver. His voice was low, steady, and carved with conviction. "She was mine long before you knew her name," he said. "If you want to keep her, you'll have to fight for what was never yours." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The bride's hand went to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock and something else, something like hope. The groom laughed, trying to mask his fear. "You think you can stand against me? Against this town, The Apache took one step closer, the firelight catching the silver beads of his necklace, the muscles in his shoulders tensing beneath the glow. "Then I'll fight," he said quietly, "for what's already mine." The silence that followed was heavier than gunpowder. No one moved. Even the wind seemed to pause, waiting for the world to take its next breath. The woman's heart pounded in her chest as she looked between the two men, the one chosen for her by duty, and the one chosen by fate. The Apache's eyes met hers, and in that moment, everything around them disappeared. It was as if the years between them melted away, and the memory of the river, the promise, and the love that defied everything came rushing back. But love born in defiance always comes with a price. The sheriff, standing near the porch, slowly reached for his revolver, knowing the law would side with the man of money. The guests began to whisper, the crowd pressing closer. The desert wind picked up, carrying sand and tension through the air. The horses grew restless, sensing the storm that was about to break. The bride tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. All she could do was look at him, her eyes pleading for something she couldn't say aloud. The Apache raised his chin, his expression calm but fierce, as if he had already accepted his fate. His people had fought greater battles than this one. The fight for land, for dignity, for the right to exist, and now, for love. He knew the odds, knew what it meant to stand alone. But he also knew what it meant to live without her, and that was a battle he refused to lose. The groom's voice broke the silence. "If it's a fight you want, you'll get it," he said, stepping forward. The men around him reached for their guns, but before anyone could move, a sudden gust blew through the courtyard, scattering the lantern flames and plunging half the yard into shadow. The fire flickered wildly, painting the Apache's face in streaks of light and darkness. He stood tall, his gaze fixed on her, his voice steady as he spoke one last time, words that cut through the night like the edge of a blade. "This isn't just a promise," he said, "it's destiny." And before anyone could stop him, he turned toward the fire, drew the blade from his side, and marked the ground before her father's porch a silent challenge, ancient and unbreakable. The flames flared, the drums from the distant canyon began again, and the story of that night, the night when love defied every boundary, was only beginning. The wind carried his final words into the darkness, a whisper that would echo through every heart that heard it. "Then I'll fight," he said, his eyes never leaving hers, "for what's already mine." And as the fire roared higher, no one knew what dawn would bring. Only that by morning, nothing in that valley would ever be the same again. The flames that night burned bright against the desert wind, throwing long, moving shadows across the courtyard. The people of the town stood frozen, watching the Apache as if time itself had stopped. No one dared move or speak. His challenge had been clear-etched into the very dirt of the rancher's land. Yet beneath that silence, fear and curiosity twisted together in every heart. The men whispered that it was madness, that no native could stand against the law or the power of the ranching families. But some of the older ones, those who'd lived through the border wars, looked at him and saw something deeper, spirit that refused to die. The bride's father, a man hardened by years of dealing with cattle, drought, and debts, stepped forward. His boots crunched on the gravel as he looked down at the mark in the ground. The firelight reflected in his eyes like the glow of a forge. "You've got nerve," he said quietly, his voice carrying enough weight that even the sheriff hesitated. "But this is my land, and she's my daughter. You think one man can take back what's already been promised?" The Apache met his gaze without flinching. "A promise means nothing when it's made by fear," he said. His voice was low, steady, and every word struck deep. "You sold her like cattle, not knowing her heart had already been spoken for." The older man's jaw tightened. Around them, the wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of the drums again from the distant canyons, a reminder of the world that still beat beyond the white fences and lantern light. She stood on the porch, trembling as the tension grew between them. The firelight flickered across her face, revealing the tears she'd tried to hide. She wanted to speak, to tell them both what her heart truly wanted, but the words felt trapped inside her throat. The man she was promised to stood beside her, his hand tightening possessively around her arm as if he feared she might slip away. "You'll stay where you are," he whispered under his breath, his smile masking his anger. "You're not going anywhere." The Apache's eyes shifted toward them, seeing the way she flinched beneath the other man's grip. He didn't move, but his silence was louder than any shout. The sheriff stepped forward then, trying to break the rising storm. "That's enough," he said. "This town doesn't need another fight over pride or women. You ride back to your land, Apache, and forget this ever happened." But his words held no power. The air itself seemed to reject them. The moment had already gone too far. When the wind died, the Apache turned and mounted his horse again. He didn't speak another word, didn't look back at the crowd that watched him leave. But his eyes lingered on her one last time. That look carried a promise no man could erase. Then he turned his horse toward the canyon and disappeared into the dark, leaving behind a silence so heavy that even the fire dared not crackle. In the days that followed, the town could talk of nothing else. The story spread from the saloon to the general store, changing slightly each time it was told. Some said he'd threatened to burn the ranch. Others claimed he'd challenged the groom to a duel. The truth no longer mattered. What mattered was the fear that came with his name. To the ranchers, he was a reminder of the old ways, a symbol of a people who refused to bow to white law. To others, especially the quiet ones who lived close to the canyon, he was something else entirely, a man, fighting for what he believed was his right. She spent those days in silence, moving through the house like a ghost. Every time she looked out toward the distant cliffs, her heart would race. The memory of that night replayed over and over in her mind, the fire, his voice, and the words that refused to fade. "Then I'll fight for what's already mine." She tried to convince herself it had been a mistake, that he would never return, but deep down, she knew better. He had always been a man of his word. Her father, unsettled by the whispers in town, ordered extra guards on the ranch. He told his men to watch the horizon and to shoot if they saw movement near the canyon. The groom, eager to prove his strength, took it further, riding into the desert with hired guns, claiming he would settle the matter before the wedding. He wanted to make an example of the Apache, to show the town that no man, native or not, could stand against him. But the desert has its own rules. Those who enter it with arrogance often find more than they bargained for. 2 nights after they rode out, one of the men returned alone, his face pale and eyes wide with terror. He said nothing at first, only handed the sheriff a blood-stained hat and whispered, "He was waiting for us." After that, no one dared to follow. The groom returned later, furious and humiliated, his pride bruised more than his body. He never spoke of what he saw, but his men swore they'd heard chanting in the wind before they fled. The townsfolk began to avoid the canyon. Strange fires were seen at night, and riders claimed to hear drums echoing across the ridges. The old women whispered that the spirits were restless, that love and vengeance had stirred something ancient beneath the desert soil. And every time the wind changed, carrying the scent of smoke, she felt it in her chest, the pull toward something she could neither explain nor escape. The wedding was postponed twice under the pretense of family matters, though everyone knew the truth. The bride had grown pale and distant, her thoughts far away, her heart caught between 2 worlds. The groom grew more possessive, his patience running thin. He accused her of still loving the Apache, of betraying him with silence. She said nothing, but her eyes gave her away. Late one night, unable to bear it any more, she rode out toward the edge of the property. The moon was high, lighting the desert in a silver glow. The wind was cold, whispering through the dry grass. She didn't know what she hoped to find, only that something inside her told her he was near. She followed the sound of the river until she reached the old tree where they had met as children. The branches swayed gently, and for a moment, the world felt still again. Then she saw him. He stood on the opposite side of the river, silent and watching. His hair moved with the wind, his body strong and still as a carved statue. She wanted to run to him, to speak, but fear and love tangled inside her like vines. The river between them glowed with moonlight, dividing 2 lives that had been joined by fate, but separated by the world. He didn't move closer. He simply looked at her, his expression calm, as if to say he already knew everything she wanted to say. Finally, his voice broke the silence. They will not stop, he said softly. Your father, your husband, they will keep coming until one of us is gone. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. Please, you have to go, she whispered. If they catch you here, they'll kill you. He smiled faintly, though there was no joy in it. Then let them try. His eyes softened when he looked at her. You forget what the desert teaches us. What is taken by force can be reclaimed by fire. Before she could answer, a sound cut through the stillness, the distant echo of horses. She turned sharply toward the noise, panic flooding her chest. Her father's men were coming, their torches like moving stars against the darkness. She looked back to warn him, but he was already gone. Only the ripples on the water remained, the faint scent of smoke drifting on the wind. When the riders reached her, they found her trembling near the riverbank. She told them she'd gone out to clear her mind, that she hadn't seen anyone. They didn't believe her, but they said nothing. The sheriff who'd come along glanced toward the canyon and sighed. If he's out there, he said, this won't end quietly. That night, as the guards patrolled the ranch and the bride sat alone in her room, the drums began again in the distance. Slow and steady, like a heartbeat carried on the wind. The groom lay awake, gripping his revolver, staring into the dark. Her father sat by the window, wondering how a single man could make an entire town uneasy. And out there in the desert, the Apache watched the lights of the ranch flicker like dying stars. The war between love and law had already begun, though no one would admit it yet. By the time dawn touched the red cliffs, both sides would know this was no longer about land or pride. It was about something much older, much stronger, and far more dangerous than either of them understood. The desert had chosen its own path, and no man, no promise, could change what was coming next. The next few weeks turned the valley into a place caught between two worlds. The townspeople tried to go about their days, pretending nothing had changed. But the tension was there in every glance, every whisper, every sound carried by the wind. The Apache's shadow lingered even when he wasn't seen. Men guarding the ranch claimed to hear the distant echo of drums near midnight. Cattle scattered for no reason under the moonlight. The old women said the spirits were restless again. That love had disturbed something ancient that didn't belong to men with guns or preachers with papers. Inside the ranch house, the atmosphere had turned heavy. The bride's father no longer smiled at supper, and the groom's temper flared at the smallest things. He drank more now, his words slurred with bitterness, convinced everyone around him was plotting against him. The woman he was supposed to marry had stopped speaking much, her voice fading into quiet answers. She spent most of her days sitting by the window, her gaze drifting toward the horizon, where the red cliffs met the sky. Every sunset reminded her of him, of the night when he had stood against the world for her. Her father noticed the change in her and didn't know whether to fear or pity it. He was a man who had spent his life building walls around his land, his heart, and now around his daughter. He thought he was protecting her, but deep down, he knew he was losing her. Still, pride kept him from admitting it. The ranch was his legacy, and the marriage he'd arranged was part of the deal that would secure his future. He told himself that love was for dreamers, not for men who'd bled for their land. But when he saw her staring toward the canyons, her hands folded like someone praying for something she couldn't name, his chest tightened in a way he didn't understand. The Apache had not disappeared. He watched from afar, unseen but ever present. From the high cliffs, he could see the ranch lights at night, each flicker of flame reminding him that she was still there, still trapped in a world that wasn't hers. His people warned him that he was walking a path that led to ruin. An elder once told him that the white man's world was built on promises made with chains. They will destroy what they cannot own, the old man said, and love is the one thing they can never own. But he couldn't listen. His heart had already made its choice. He spent his days preparing, quietly mending weapons, scouting the edges of the ranch, learning the movement of the guards. He didn't plan to take her by force, but he knew the day would come when he'd have to defend what he'd already claimed. Sometimes at night, he would ride to the old tree by the river and wait, hoping she might return. She didn't, but the memory of her presence lingered in the air, and he could almost hear her voice carried by the wind. Back in town, the sheriff tried to keep peace, though he knew peace was a fragile thing. He'd lived long enough to see love and hate tear apart more than one family. He didn't want another war between the settlers and the Apache. He remembered the blood that had soaked this desert years ago, when men fought over land and pride until there was nothing left but bones and regret. Yet every report he received, guards disappearing, livestock stolen, warnings carved into the dirt told him the fire was building again. And this time, it wasn't about territory. It was about a woman and the kind of love that could burn through reason. The groom's pride had turned into obsession. He couldn't stand the thought that she might still be thinking about that man. Every time he looked at her, he saw guilt in her silence, and it drove him wild. He ordered more men to patrol the ranch and began carrying his revolver even inside the house. At night, he'd stand at the window, convinced he saw movement in the shadows. The desert played tricks on him, figures shifting in the dark. Whispers carried on the wind, but whether they were real or not, the fear was real enough to keep him awake until dawn. One night, as the moon hung low and red, one of his men came running to the house. "We found something," he said breathlessly. They rode out to the southern fence, where the sand had been disturbed. There, in the moonlight, they saw a single spear planted in the ground, feathers tied to it, swaying with the wind. At its base lay a strip of cloth, the same pale color as the bride's dress from the night of the gathering. The groom's face turned white. "He's mocking me," he said through clenched teeth, but the others knew better. It wasn't mockery. It was a warning. The following morning, the town buzzed with rumors again. Some claimed the Apache was gathering a band of warriors from the canyon. Others said he'd cursed the ranch, that misfortune would fall on anyone who tried to separate them. The preacher tried to calm them, saying no man could fight destiny, but few listened. Fear spreads faster than truth in a small town, and before long, even the children whispered stories about the Apache who defied God and man for love. Meanwhile, she began to sense the world closing in around her. Her father kept her inside, claiming it was for her safety, but she felt more like a prisoner than a daughter. Every window became a reminder of the life she couldn't reach. The sound of the wind outside grew louder each night, like a voice calling her name. She wrote letters she couldn't send, words of apology, longing, and confusion, and hid them beneath her bed. She still dreamed of him, of his voice, the look in his eyes when he'd said those words, "Then I'll fight for what's already mine." Days turned into weeks, and the desert grew hotter, harsher. The air shimmered with dust, and the nights no longer felt safe. Men from the ranch reported seeing strange lights moving along the cliffs. The cattle grew skittish, breaking fences without reason. Her father blamed superstition, but the fear in his eyes betrayed him. The land itself felt unsettled, as if it were holding its breath. Then, one afternoon, a storm rolled in from the west. Thunder rumbled across the canyons, and rain began to fall in sheets, rare and fierce. The guards scattered for shelter, and she found herself alone for the first time in days. The wind pushed against the windows, rattling them like impatient hands. And then she heard it, a knock. Soft, quick, urgent. She turned, her heart pounding. When she opened the door, rain rushed in, cold against her face. He stood there, soaked from the storm, his eyes burning with the same fire she remembered. For a moment, neither spoke. The world outside faded, the thunder, the wind, everything. Only their breathing filled the silence. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered. He shook his head slowly. "I told you I would," he said. "They'll kill you if they find you," she said, tears welling in her eyes. He stepped closer, his hand trembling as it brushed against hers. "Let them try," he said again. "I didn't come to take you. I came to see if your heart still remembers." Before she could answer, a sound broke through the storm, the heavy thud of boots, voices shouting from the barn. He turned toward the sound instantly, his body tense. She grabbed his arm. "Go," she begged. "Please, before they see you." He hesitated, looking at her one last time. "If they come for me again," he said, "I won't run." Then he disappeared into the rain, leaving her standing in the doorway. Her heart split between fear and hope. The men rushed into the house moments later, weapons drawn. but they found nothing. The groom searched every corner, rage twisting his face. When he saw her standing there, shaking, he grabbed her wrist hard enough to leave marks. "You saw him, didn't you?" he hissed. She didn't answer. Her silence was louder than any confession. That night when the storm passed, the desert fell quiet again. But it was the kind of quiet that hides something dangerous underneath. The Apache returned to the canyon, soaked and shivering, but alive. He looked out across the valley where the ranch lights burned faintly in the distance and knew what had to come next. There was no turning back now. The promise he had made to her, to himself, and to the land had become his purpose. The fight would come soon, and when it did, it wouldn't just be between men. It would be between the old world and the new, between what was promised and what was truly meant to be. As the first light of dawn broke across the desert, the drums began again, faint but growing stronger, echoing through the cliffs like a heartbeat. The desert was awake, and the battle for love land. Now destiny was about to begin. The desert had turned restless, as if the earth itself knew what was coming. The sky hung low and heavy, bruised with the colors of a coming storm. Every creature in the valley moved differently that week. Horses grew uneasy, dogs barked into the wind, and the nights carried strange echoes that no one could explain. The drums that once came faintly from the canyons now beat louder, closer, steady as thunder, rolling beneath the ground. People in town began locking their doors early, whispering that the Apache was preparing for something far greater than revenge. At the ranch, no one slept peacefully. The groom stayed awake with a rifle across his lap, pacing the front porch like a man standing guard over a secret he couldn't control. The bride's father moved through the house in silence, weary from too many sleepless nights, his face lined with regret. He had thought the matter would fade with time, that the Apache would give up and the girl would accept her fate. But love had become wildfire impossible to contain once it found air. He'd tried to reason with his daughter, but she had changed. There was a quiet strength in her now, something he couldn't quite reach. One night she came to his room and spoke softly. "Father, what if you're wrong about him?" Her voice trembled, but there was courage in her eyes. He looked up, startled. "Wrong? You don't understand what kind of man he is," he said. "He's dangerous. He comes from people who take what they want." She hesitated, then answered, "Maybe he only takes back what was taken first." The old man's jaw tightened. He wanted to shout, to remind her of all he'd sacrificed for her safety. But he couldn't find the words. Something in her tone, calm, almost mournful, made him realize he'd already lost her heart by morning. The news spread that one of the outer herds had gone missing. The men found the fences cut and tracks leading toward the canyon. The groom gathered his hired guns and swore he'd end it that day. The bride begged him not to go, clutching his arm, but he shoved her hand away. "You want to protect him?" he said, his voice sharp with rage. "Then pray I don't find him first." He rode out with 6 men, leaving behind a cloud of dust and a silence that hung like smoke. Hours passed and the sun sank low. The bride waited on the porch, her hands twisting in her lap, eyes fixed on the horizon. Her father sat beside her, silent, his hat pulled low. The wind shifted, bringing the faint sound of gunfire from the direction of the cliffs. Her heart jumped. Then, nothing. Only the cry of a hawk circling high above. When the riders finally returned, they were fewer. 2 men were missing. The rest were pale, shaken, their clothes torn, and faces marked by sand and fear. The groom's eyes were wild as he dismounted. "He's not a man," he spat. "He's a shadow. He moves like smoke." He threw his rifle down and stormed into the house. No one dared to ask what had happened in the canyon. But everyone saw the truth in their faces. Something out there had beaten them, not just with strength, but with spirit. That night, the wind carried the smell of smoke again, faint but distinct. The bride stepped outside and looked toward the cliffs. In the distance, she could see small fires burning along the ridge, signal fires, bright against the dark. She felt drawn to them as if they were calling her name. Her father came to the door behind her. "You see what he's done?" he said. "He wants war." She turned slowly, her eyes wet but steady. "No, father," she said. "He wants to be heard." The following day, the sheriff came to the ranch. He looked older than before, weighed down by what he knew he couldn't stop. "You need to move your daughter into town," he told the rancher. "This isn't going to end with talk," the father nodded. But when he went to tell her, she refused to leave. "If I go," she said quietly, "he'll think I gave up." He stared at her, torn between love and anger. "You don't understand what kind of danger you're in," he said. She looked back at him and replied, "Maybe it's not me who's in danger." That night, the wind carried the smell of smoke again, faint but distinct. The bride stepped outside and looked toward the cliffs. In the distance, she could see small fires burning along the ridge signal fires, bright against the dark. She felt drawn to them as if they were calling her name. Her father came to the door behind her. "You see what he's done?" he said. "He wants war." She turned slowly, her eyes wet but steady. "No, father," she said. "He wants to be heard." The following day, the sheriff came to the ranch. He looked older than before, weighed down by what he knew he couldn't stop. "You need to move your daughter into town," he told the rancher. "This isn't going to end with talk." The father nodded, but when he went to tell her, she refused to leave. "If I go," she said quietly, "he'll think I gave up." He stared at her, torn between love and anger. "You don't understand what kind of danger you're in," he said. She looked back at him and replied, "Maybe it's not me who's in danger." That night the storm finally broke. The sky ripped open with lightning, and rain poured across the desert like a flood. The wind howled through the canyons, carrying voices that could have been spirits or could have been men. The guards struggled to keep their lanterns lit as thunder rolled over the ridges. Through the storm's roar came the distant echo of horses, their hooves pounding across wet earth. The bride ran to the window and saw movement in the dark shadows moving swiftly through the rain. Closing in on the ranch, the alarm was raised. Men shouted, rifles cracked, and the air filled with chaos. Her father grabbed his shotgun, yelling for her to stay inside. But the noise outside grew louder, closer, until the front windows shook from the force of horses galloping past. Through the downpour, she saw flashes of figures, some wearing wide-brimmed hats. Others bareheaded, their hair whipping in the storm. The Apache had come, but they weren't alone. Some were his kin, but others were settlers who had turned against the greed and cruelty of the ranchers. It was a storm of men and fate colliding all at once. Inside, the groom shouted orders, his rage boiling into madness. "Shoot anyone who comes close." He screamed, firing blindly into the rain. The bride cried out for him to stop, but he wouldn't listen. Her father tried to pull her back to protect her, but she broke free. Running toward the barn where the sound of fighting grew louder. The lightning flashed again, and in that brief light, she saw him. He stood tall amid the storm, his skin glistening with rain, his expression calm but fierce. His eyes met hers across the chaos, and everything else faded: the gunfire, the thunder, the shouting. For a heartbeat, there was only silence. Then a shot rang out. She screamed as he stumbled, dropping to one knee, clutching his arm. The groom appeared behind her, the smoking rifle in his hand, his face twisted in triumph. "That's what happens," he said, "to anyone who touches what's mine." Before he could fire again, she struck his arm with all her strength. The gun fell, and they struggled in the mud as thunder split the sky. The Apache rose slowly, blood streaking down his side, his eyes locked on them. Her father burst through the door, shouting for everyone to stop, but no one heard him. The world had gone deaf to reason. The Apache stepped forward, his blade drawn, not in rage, but in something heavier: finality. "You took everything," he said quietly. "Now I take it back." But before he could move, lightning flashed again, blinding everyone. The horses screamed and broke their tethers, the fences collapsing as wind and rain tore through the yard. In that chaos, the groom grabbed a pistol from the ground and raised it. But the bride stepped between them, her hands outstretched. "No more," she cried. "Enough." The storm's fury drowned her words, but the meaning was clear. The Apache froze, torn between love and vengeance. The groom's eyes flickered hesitation, then rage. He pulled the trigger. The shot echoed through the storm, a single sound that silenced the world. For a moment, no one moved. The rain poured harder, washing the dust and blood into the earth. Her father dropped to his knees, calling her name. The Apache fell beside her, catching her before she hit the ground. Her eyes fluttered open, her breath shallow. "You came for me," she whispered. He looked down at her, his face torn between pain and disbelief. The fire from the signal hills still burned behind them, bright against the storm, painting the sky red. Around them, the men had stopped fighting. Their weapons lowered, their anger swallowed by the sight before them. The Apache held her close as the rain fell harder, his lips trembling as he whispered something no one could hear. The storm began to fade, but the tension in the air didn't break. The groom backed away slowly, his pistol shaking in his hand, realizing too late the line he had crossed. Her father rose, his face pale with horror. The lightning flashed again, casting every shadow sharp and deep, somewhere beyond the ridge. The drums began once more, slow, mournful, echoing like the heartbeat of the desert itself. The sound carried through the valley, through the hearts of every soul who heard it. Marking the moment when everything changed, the Apache lifted his head, his eyes glowing like the last embers of a dying fire. He rose to his feet, holding her gently, as if she were the most fragile thing in the world. The storm had not yet ended, and neither had the fight. What came next would decide everything: the land, the love, the legacy. The air was thick with it, alive and waiting for the dawn that would decide who would stand and who would fall. The first light of dawn crept over the ridges, painting the soaked valley in shades of gray and amber. The storm had passed, but its fury still lingered in the air. The ground was soft with mud and ash, the fences broken, the fire pits drowned in pools of rainwater. The silence that followed was heavy, as if the world itself was mourning what had just unfolded. The Apache knelt in the yard, holding her in his arms, his face still streaked with rain and blood. Her father stood only a few paces away, his shotgun forgotten, his hands trembling as he tried to understand the weight of what had been done. The groom was gone, disappeared into the desert before anyone could stop him. Pride and anger swallowed by the darkness that now hung over the ranch. The woman's breath came faintly, her voice weak but calm. "You kept your word," she whispered, her eyes fluttering open to meet his. "You fought for me." He brushed the wet hair from her face, his touch trembling. "I fought because you are part of me," he said. "Not to own, but to protect." She tried to smile, and for a moment the storm's memory faded. Her father knelt beside them then, the lines in his face deepened by regret. "I never meant for this," he said softly. "All I wanted was to keep you safe." The Apache looked up at him, his expression unreadable. "Safety means nothing when love is buried alive," he answered. The old man lowered his eyes, his heart too heavy to argue. The sun rose slowly, its light spilling across the valley, revealing the cost of the night. The men who had fought now stood still, unsure of what came next. No one spoke of victory or defeat. There were no sides anymore, only faces marked by loss. The sheriff arrived with his deputies, saw the broken fences and the wounded, and said nothing. He holstered his weapon and simply sighed, knowing that justice, in this place, had already been decided by something older than law. He helped gather the injured, ordered the fires put out, told the others to bury their anger with the dead. The bride's wound was not fatal. The bullet had grazed her side, missing her heart by inches. The Apache carried her inside and laid her on the same bed she'd slept in since she was a child. Her father watched silently as the healer from the Cununa woman, older than the desert itself, came to tend to her. She ground herbs between her palms, whispering prayers in a language the others didn't understand. When she was done, she placed her hand on the Apache's shoulder and said, "She will live, but so must you. The desert takes what it's owed. Leave before it decides to take more." For 2 days, he stayed near her, tending to the wounds that no one else could see. They spoke little, the silence between them saying what words could not. She asked him once if he would ever forgive her father. He said forgiveness was like rain, it comes when the sky decides, not when men demand it. When she finally stood again, pale but alive, she went to the window and looked toward the cliffs. The fires on the ridge were gone now, the drums silent, replaced by the sound of wind moving through the mesquite. "It's over," she said quietly. He stood beside her, shaking his head. "Nothing that changes hearts is ever over," he said. "It just becomes part of the land." Her father entered the room then, walking with the slow steps of a man who had seen too much. He looked at the Apache and spoke with a voice stripped of pride. "I can't undo what's been done," he said. "But I can choose what happens next. Take her if she wishes to go. I will not stand in your way." The Apache studied him for a long moment. "It was never about taking," he said. "She is not a prize to be carried away. She is her own." The woman turned to her father, her eyes glistening. "Then let me decide," she said. The decision didn't come easily. For days, the house felt caught between two worlds. The ranchers whispered that letting her go would bring shame. The townsfolk said it was madness to let her live among those they once called enemies. But the old ways had already begun to crumble. The storm had changed everything: broken fences, yes, but also the invisible walls that had divided the people of the valley. The Apache rode out each morning to help rebuild the outer pens, working beside the same men who had once raised rifles against him. No one spoke much, but their silence carried understanding. The land demanded peace, and for the first time, they began to listen. One evening, she walked out to the old tree by the river, the place where it had all begun. The sunset bathed the land in gold, and the water shimmered with light. She found him there, sitting quietly, his reflection rippling in the current. "You could leave," she said. "You could go back to your people, far from this place." He nodded slowly. "I could," he said, "but my heart would still remain here. The land remembers what the heart cannot forget." She knelt beside him, her fingers brushing the cool water. "Then stay," she said softly. "Not as a fighter, but as part of this land with me." The words hung between them like a promise the earth itself could hear. He turned toward her, his expression tender, but filled with weight. "If we stay, they will never see us the same," he said. She smiled faintly. "Then let them learn." Months passed and the valley began to heal. The rains brought life back to the soil, and the grass grew green again. The ranch slowly returned to work, its fences mended, its herds growing strong. The groom never returned. Some said he'd gone south, others whispered that the desert had claimed him. Her father aged quickly after that, spending most of his days on the porch, watching the horizon as if waiting for peace to finally settle in his bones. He spoke little, but in his eyes there was a quiet acceptance, a recognition that love had chosen a path no man could command. The townsfolk adjusted in time. The whispers faded, replaced by stories told in the saloon about the storm that changed the valley, about the Apache who defied a rancher and won not through war, but through truth. Some called it a legend. Others said it was just a tale the desert carried to remind men that pride can burn faster than lightning, years later. When travelers passed through the valley, they spoke of a woman who ran a ranch with her husband and Apache, who wore the same necklace of beads and bone that had once glimmered in the firelight of rebellion. They said their land was different from any other, that no man went hungry there, no one rode away without feeling the strange calm that settled over the place. The wind that moved through that valley carried not the echo of drums anymore, but the soft rhythm of peace, the kind that grows only from love that has endured every storm. Sometimes, on quiet nights, when the sky was clear and the stars spread wide over the desert, the woman would walk to the river and stand beneath the old tree. The air would be still, and she could almost hear the echoes of that long-ago night, the drums, the storm, and his voice whispering through the dark. "Then I'll fight for what's already mine." Those words had once been a battle cry, but now they were a memory, a promise fulfilled. He had fought not to claim her, but to keep her free. And in that freedom, they had both found something worth more than land or legacy. When the old man passed, they buried him near the same tree by the river. The Apache carved a stone for him, plain and simple, with only a few words. He learned too late that love cannot be traded. The woman placed a wildflower beside it and whispered a prayer. The wind lifted gently, carrying her voice across the valley. As the years went on, the desert itself seemed to soften. The once harsh wind turned gentle in the evenings, and the nights grew quieter. The scars of the past faded into stories told by the fire. The kind that make listeners pause and think about what it means to belong to the land, to love, to each other. And when strangers asked about the legend of the Apache and the rancher's daughter, the locals would smile and say the same thing every time. It wasn't a war, they'd say. It was a promise, one that the desert still keeps. In the end, the valley became what it was always meant, to be a place where love and courage had left their mark, where the wind carried not fear, but peace. And though the fires of that night had long burned out, the story remained carved into the heart of the land, whispered by the river, and remembered in every sunrise that touched the canyons with light.